gentlemen. Welcome to day 3 of the Xinjiang crisis, Genocide, Crimes Against Humanity, Justice. Very delighted to be launching into our 3rd day here. Hopefully our in-person folks will join us in the next half hour or so. I remember how hard it is getting up this early on the 3rd day of a conference, 3-day conference. And I'm delighted to welcome Kate Ferguson from Protection Approaches, who is going to chair our roundtable 4 this morning, which is titled Responsibility of International Institutions and Corporations. Thank you, Kate.
So much for that introduction, and what a pleasure it is to be here for such an esteemed and just really important panel that we're looking at a component of responses to genocide and atrocity that is very often missed, I think, even in policy conversations and NGO conversations especially, on what we as consumers, as citizens, as activists, as scholars can do in the face of such appalling crimes. We're talking about the responsibilities of institutions and corporations. And it's always been my belief that we have a collective responsibility to help protect people and populations from discrimination, but especially from mass atrocity crimes. And that this is a responsibility that stretches through states, and that doesn't dilute the responsibility on state leadership, but passes through states to the composite parts of our societies. And integral in that is our institutions, our universities, and business. And strategies of atrocity prevention, which we were talking about yesterday, and Nusrat and I were on a panel with other esteemed colleagues talking about what those strategies might look like. These strategies that center decision-making around how best to mitigate risks facing populations, they're not limited to states. In fact, institutions, corporations, universities, they can all implement these kinds of processes and frameworks in their decision-making. So I'm going to introduce all of our speakers, and then we're going to go through that running order. Time is tight, so let's please keep to 8 minutes. And that means that you kind of have a grace minute or so on the side. But we want to keep some time for conversation, and we've got 6 fabulous presentations today, so that's a lot to get through. We've got Siobhan, Alan, and Eva Pills, who are coming from the Global Legal Action Network in King's College London, who are going to be talking about international legal strategies in respect to the situation in Xinjiang. We've got Laura Murphy from Sheffield Hallam University talking about state-sponsored forced labour in the Uyghur region and current failures of corporate social responsibility and due diligence. We've got Alicia HENNIG on the case for ethics and reflections in the Uyghur region and kind of how businesses can really implement those frameworks. We've got Nusrat GHANI MP, who's done such fantastic work looking at these very questions around corporate and business responsibility. So we'll be talking about her committee's report, Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee report on Uyghur forced labour in Xinjiang, and UK values. We've then got Rachel Harris from SOAS, who's going to be talking about Uyghur heritage and the charge of cultural genocide and what role UNESCO should play. And then finally, but not least, we've got James McMURRAY from the University of Sussex talking about academic action and scholarly responsibility, which of course is really important that we're here at a university and we sort of look at the tables that we are literally sitting at right now. So that is enough from me. I will hand over to Siobhan and Eva right now. Thanks ever so much.
For the introduction and for chairing, and I would really on this panel only want to very briefly preface what we will hear from Siobhan Allen from the Global Legal Action Network by essentially inviting or continuing the reflection that Kate started us off on, reflecting on the kinds of challenges that global transnational advocacy on the Xinjiang issue is facing. And I think that it is natural and very important in the context of atrocities like those happening in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region to think about them as crime times to think about the perpetrators, to consider, especially if you come at this issue from a legal angle, to consider these primary perpetrators, their superiors, legal liability. But as the conference has shown, and as Kate just now reminded us, there are, of course, many actors that are involved and that at different levels make contributions to these wrongs, these injustices, these human rights violations. And that raises the important and complex issue of complicity. And again, coming at this from a legal angle, I think that it is important to realize that some of these contributions may fall short of triggering legal liability, but yet perhaps be related to that collective responsibility that Kate just now mentioned. But even also where legal duties come into our analysis, and where it is important to raise those and enforce those duties, doing so may merely be a kind of stepping stone to achieving a wider political goal that engages our collective and political responsibilities. It is considerations of this kind, I think, that inspire the important work of organizations such as the Global Legal Action Network. And with this very brief observation, given the constraints of time, I would just like to hand over to Siobhan. Thank you very much.
To cover all international legal strategies in one panel, never mind in 5 minutes, nor am I qualified to do that. There's other people in this room that are much more so. So this isn't intended to be a comprehensive overview of all international legal strategies. It's rather food for thought. So by outlining what we at GLAN are doing and the angle that we've taken on this, hoping to just trigger some thinking that could percolate in some legal brains here about other ways we might be able to take some kind of action to achieve accountability or influence change. And I would also preface by saying that critical to any legal strategy is ensuring legitimacy. So ensuring that any strategies you come up with will actually have impact and not cause any unforeseen harm. So engagement with Uyghur partners is key. It's key that Uyghur organizations are involved in devising and driving forward any legal strategies. So all of our work on Xinjiang is in partnership with the World Uyghur Congress. There's been lots of discussion in the last couple of days about the utility of international law in this situation, or whether we should just jettison it. I would say that I agree wholeheartedly with some of the speakers, Shona, Roger, Arsalan, who have noted that there are avenues that we can still use and we should. I agree with Tatiana, who said that it's not a binary option. We should be coming at this from all of the angles we possibly can, and coordinated legal action is greater than the sum of its parts. So we at GLAN have focused on looking at the flow of goods across borders. So if you visualize that as wide arcs that are emanating outside of Xinjiang to the US, to the UK, to Europe, looking at where along that arc we can chip away. There's a really widespread matrix of actors that are involved in enabling, profiting from, and incentivizing the continuation of the forced labor situation. And that presents a lot of opportunities about different potential defendants to legal actions. So much of the discussion in the last couple of days has rightly been about the source, about Xinjiang, about the perpetrators, but also it's worth looking at some of the other actors, so retailers and corporates that are exporting to Xinjiang or importing from there. Investors that are connected to those corporates are connected to the region. Obviously, governments are critical in formulating legislation and policy around the flow of goods. Things like social audit firms that are whitewashing some of the actions of retailers, despite the fact that they say their audits, in fact, don't pick up on forced labor or human rights abuses. There's also so many sectors that you could challenge: cotton, tomatoes, solar, electronics, or even financial services. So are there financial products that are listed on stock exchanges around the world that trace back to a parent company in Xinjiang? So there's so many ways of looking at all of these potential non-state responsible actors. So we have been looking at the destination, the endpoint, or the beneficiaries of this system, and are challenging the customs authorities in the UK for allowing the import of cotton from Xinjiang. In addition to obviously wanting to halt that importation and circulation of goods, there's also a kind of wider theory of change about eliminating the economic incentive and the market that's there. If you remove the market in the US and Europe, and the UK for goods. The aim is to remove the incentive for international actors to be involved in what's currently profitable, but otherwise may not be, and to remove the incentive for accelerating production of goods produced by forced labour. So in the UK, our challenge is that there isn't one piece of legislation that you can easily point to that all of this fits into. So you have to be quite creative in what legislation to use and creative in how you explain, in a legal sense, how the situation in Xinjiang actually fits into that legislation. So we do have a piece of 19th century legislation called the Foreign Prison Made Goods Act, 1897, which does squarely say that it prohibits the import of goods produced in foreign prisons. So that's a very straightforward challenge as to why the customs authorities are not confiscating goods that are actually made in prisons and detention centers in Xinjiang. But it's more complicated for other categories of goods produced using forced labor, as Dr. Zenz outlined in his first presentation, when you look at the labor transfer schemes, the poverty alleviation schemes, where there are varying grades of how evident the coercion actually is. And so the way that we have formulated that is using proceeds of crime legislation, that it's a criminal offence in the UK to facilitate or deal with criminal property. Cotton from Xinjiang is obviously criminal property because they constitute the benefit of criminal conduct. That underlying criminal conduct is, of course, the crimes against humanity of enslavement and forced labor that we've been talking about over the last few days. The challenge that we are raising is to the fact that the government has not imposed specific customs restrictions or import restrictions preventing the import of clearly criminal property. So we're arguing that it's an untenable situation if customs officers are not provided with a specific customs rule that enables them to confiscate those goods as they're coming in. So where Parliament has considered behaviour so reprehensible as to make it a criminal offence for citizens through the proceeds of crime legislation, it's irrational that we say for customs authorities to be permitted to do it or in fact actually forced to do it if they don't have an option. So I would just wrap up by saying there's been a lot of debate in the last couple of days about the political situation, the political ramifications of this, the need for political will to actually get traction and movement on this, geopolitical ramifications of taking action or inaction, and just to flag that the angle that we're taking arguably takes it slightly outside of that really sensitive political sphere and looks at the economic sphere and the economic complicity. So maybe some very dry legal arguments about the business side of things, the economic side of things, may lead to some really helpful legal precedents that, as I say, would be part of that calculation of all of these coordinated kinds of actions being greater than the sum of their parts and moving it a little bit away from the political hot potato. So I think that's my time. So I'll wrap up.
Really fabulous and also fabulous timekeeping. Thanks so much for us to kind of dig deep there and really take forward in a practical way. We're now going to go virtual to Laura Murphy, who's going to be talking to us on state-sponsored forced labour.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be able to be here and join you today, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to make it until now. I am thrilled to talk to you today about to sort of follow up on some of what Nurullah Elima spoke about on Wednesday, talking about the response that we've seen to the report that we made on the solar industry. Because I only have a few minutes, I can't talk about all the corporate responses and all the failures I've seen in corporate responses in the last year or so since we've been working on this. But I've decided to limit it to the solar industry because I think it gives us a couple of very clear insights that we can work from and that I think won't come as any surprise to most of the people on this panel or many of you in the audience, but that I think are very clear from the last almost year of the solar industry's engagement with this issue. And the basic claim I have to lay out here is that government regulation is extremely necessary to not just encourage, but even make possible corporate engagement and corporate responsibility in addressing forced labor. Can you hear me? Okay, I thought I thought I saw someone trying to tell me they couldn't hear me. Um, so the in October of last year, the Solar Energy Industry Association came out and tried to get ahead of the issue and say that they recognized that there were inputs into solar panels that were made in Xinjiang, and that they were looking into how to stop that from happening. It turns out they found out from the New York Times that the New York Times was going to put out an article about this very issue, and their response, as opposed to, say, the apparel industry's response, was to get out ahead of this issue. And they promised that they would come up with a protocol for tracing, for traceability in general, but it was supposed to be responsible to the Xinjiang issue. They did that in May. They put that out, and they promised that by July, there would be no Xinjiang inputs into the solar industry outputs, into solar modules. They didn't promise transparency. They only promised traceability, and that protocol only included instructions on how to trace that were bound up in hiring third-party auditors. There was no actual instructions in there on how to do this traceability for companies to do it on their own, perhaps in their own corporate social responsibility offices. And they did not focus on how to actually affect this, or even why one should actually put into place these protocols, aside from sort of broad stroke claims about forced labor, or about ethical responsibilities, and very specific concerns about if you were to have your goods seized by CBP, or Customs and Border Protection, in the United States. This seemed to be the main impetus for this protocol. But by July of 2020, when they were supposed to have pulled out of Xinjiang entirely, of course they had not. And that was because they were not and refused to pull out of being engaged in the using raw materials from Xinjiang. They insist that raw materials are defined as polysilicon, which they're not. They go much further than that. And the loophole that they engaged in was saying, oh, well, we can trace back to polysilicon, but we couldn't possibly know where the raw materials one step further come from, and therefore we're being asked too much of. And so this last month, they invested a ton of money in lobbying to not be held to the standards of not having forced labor that they themselves set up in October. So there are a couple of things that I think we learned from this process, this timeline. And one is that industry associations are building an apparatus for protecting themselves, and not obviously for ending forced labor. They are not at all able to monitor or regulate themselves. When they do set up protocols, or at least in this case, when they set up a protocol that was nominally responsible for addressing forced labor, in fact, it was really about avoiding getting in trouble with the United States government, and the United States government alone, essentially. It was very focused on CBP seizures. This protocol did not discuss forced labor. I think it mentioned it like 3 times in a quite long document. And they did not, in fact, include anything that required them to be transparent with consumers or even with the government. So it was a matter of an in-house traceability that they promised they would be able to do, but there was no apparatus within that protocol for being held responsible by anyone outside of their own companies, except for in the extreme and terrifying circumstance that they were actually having their goods seized. So one of the problems with that is that the way they were going to monitor this was through third-party auditors. But what we've learned in the process of this, of the unfolding of our report, is that while companies can and must trace their supply chains, which we've done from our desks in the rest of the world, industry associations are working hand in hand with auditors to obscure their supply chains. So not only do the protocols not require them to be transparent, but in fact, the auditors who were, there are two primary auditors in this industry, and they actually authored the protocols themselves. These protocols called only for companies to employ third-party auditors. That was the main, thrust of the protocols, and those protocols pointed to these two companies as if it were an advertisement and said, these are the companies you can trust, and did not tell companies how to do it themselves. So companies don't have the tools to do these audits themselves. The auditors themselves are compromised because they work in China and so are bound by the anti-sanctions laws that have come up recently. Plus, the president of one of those companies, in fact, worked for one of the companies that we name in our report in the years leading up to starting his own auditing firm, and still works hand in hand with many companies in China. So the ability for these companies to do that work, to do those audits, is entirely compromised, and it seems to be the only route that companies want to take. So just in conclusion, quickly, I'll say that government regulation is absolutely necessary because companies are not going to do this kind of auditing themselves. And I think that basically takes up my time, but I'm happy to answer questions.
That was perfect timing, and thank you so much for that. And I mean, absolutely, I think that's really at the heart of this panel, isn't it? Is sort of looking at the way in which we can have that relationship between government legislation and the policies of institutions and business. But thank you, there was so much in that very well-timed, succinct presentation, a real lesson to all of us. We're going to stay online now and hand over to Alicia, please.
Hope you can hear me.
Yeah,
thanks
clear.
for having me. It's a great, it really makes me happy to speak about some stuff today from the perspective of my own discipline, which is business ethics. And so far, the discipline hasn't been really active in this whole thing. And I would like to give some background information first on the discipline, because you may think it's an oxymoron. And I know business ethics may sound a bit strange to some people. So I would just shortly introduce what we're actually doing. So what we're doing is we're looking at the actions of business primarily from an ethical point of view, right? So what does it mean? It translates into a normative viewpoint, and we think about what business should or ought to do actually. And why are we doing this? Well, I think we had a lot of input on regulations and stuff, and political and legal perspectives. And the most important thing is ethics can cover what law cannot cover, right? So what is legal can still be unethical. And we have several ethical theories to start our argumentation from, so I won't go into details and bother you with the theoretical stuff. But the main question is, why do we actually need to have this discipline, right? And we heard it before from Kate. So we're talking about collective responsibility, or what I like to say is essentially responsibility is shared across politics, the economy, and the society. And this is why we need to bring in the business perspective. And this is also why we need, shake up business and remind them of their responsibility. However, there's some argumentative challenge when we look at our own, way of argumentation for or against perhaps even business responsibility. And so it's normally there can be too much state regulations, right, which leads to inertia, risk of organizational immaturity, or even paternalism, because it releases it releases kind of business to think themselves about their own responsibility. And the other thing is too few state regulation, right? So that's the other pole, and that's risking a laissez-faire kind of conduct only due to voluntariness, and then that may lead to instrumental approaches. And this is also something we can witness, of course, from a business perspective and a business ethics perspective when we conduct studies on, for example, large corporations. There's a lot of instrumental approaches visible. So anyhow, why do we actually need to have the focus on business as such? Well, first of all, because business is a part of society, right? The same rules we have in society apply or should apply and need to apply to business as well. And especially in a democracy, a business is accountable to the public. And we need to put more effort in holding these companies publicly accountable for what they are doing. The second thing is business is directly involved in the issues we're talking about, right? Environmental, pollution, climate change issues, human rights, etc. The last thing is, and this is something I will go into a bit more detail, is business has leverage. They can impact changes, right? So this is why the reach of regulation alone is a bit limited, and we need these initiatives by business. So why does the situation in Xinjiang actually matters for the business ethics discipline, or why should it actually matter? It's because when we look at the human rights discussion in China, in my opinion, Xinjiang brought in a significant turning point. Because in the past, when we talked about human rights issues in China, it was more like, okay, the Chinese suppliers, sweatshop conditions, occupational health and safety issues, over hours, safe workplace, you know, that was like the issues back then. So we're talking about like 2005, 6, and before that roundabout. But with the Xinjiang situation, it became systematic, first of all. So we're talking about systematic human rights infringements, and also by the Chinese government, and not just by, let's say, some supplier or a number of suppliers. Also, like over the years, we could see that the Chinese government actually, through better laws and more law enforcement, could tackle those supply chain issues, like the former ones, right, with the sweatshop kind of conditions. So, and what we need to do now is, or what I'm working on is, I want to develop a taxonomy to determine the level of responsibility of foreign business actors in the Xinjiang region. So I'm mostly focusing on that. And there are actually 3 questions for me to kind of guide my taxonomy. So the first one is, what kind of involvement are we talking about when we talk about foreign actors? So for example, are they just offering services or supply for the region? Do they source material from the region, or do they actually have physical, buildings there, like manufacturing, whatever buildings, and they directly produce in the region, and perhaps even employing people from the region? So these are like different degrees of involvement, which in my opinion need to be differentiated. Then the second question is, how does this involvement happen, right? Is it direct and active? So for example, these companies are even actively promoting government initiatives in the region to, for example, increase their own guanxi and political capital and also political legitimacy. Or is it more like indirectly, and we heard it from Eva Pilz, like the term complicity, for example. Is it more like they are there, they are silently accepting the status quo, and they see the participation in these measures more as a necessity of economic survival? So at least these 2 categories we can or should differentiate. And then the last one is, well, from that, concluding what's their leverage in the region, right? Are they big? Is the Chinese state perhaps economically dependent on this production facility or whatever? Are there any dependencies they can play with, for example, they can use as a leverage? And if so, they actually have the ethical responsibility to think perhaps even about a more activist position. Or at least they should think about any positive impact possible within the limits given by the government. So when this taxonomy should work, right, and I have these 3 categories. So the second would be, well, they don't have much leverage, but that still doesn't release them of their ethical responsibility to think what they can do within the limits. And if it happens to turn out that they actually have no leverage whatsoever, they actually should also, ethically speaking, think about retreating from China entirely, because there is not much legitimacy to defend, in my opinion, to which would just justify staying in such a country and contributing to such a regime. So, and then of course, like we know, like we've also heard it over the past days, there are already like available legally binding tools, right? We're speaking about the US Entity List. We are speaking about perhaps the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which may be implemented in the US and has not been signed into law yet. We're speaking about the German Lieferkettengesetz, so the supply chain law, which will, well, where they have like now 2 years for transforming their supply chains. We could see recent prosecutions in France, and then we have Australia with some bill, and in the UK, we don't know, but at least they have the Modern Slavery Act since 2015. So we already have a number of legally binding tools. And on top of that, we also have these so-called non-binding tools. This is where business ethics comes into play. So we got, you know, the ILO MNE Declaration, the UN Guiding Principles, the UN Global Compact, and so on, so on. We definitely have enough tools to make companies accountable. But still, like over the past 20 years, when we look back since the Global Compact came into practice, I'm always wondering, like looking from this discipline, has it changed anything fundamentally since their introduction? What has changed in terms of business responsibility? So I tend to what Laura said, like we need to have more government regulation. I became a kind of hardliner through my own research because I don't believe in this voluntariness anymore. So just to wrap it up a bit, or to give like a sort of outlook of what we are left with is, and how we can possibly enact more like responsible business behavior by foreign business actors in China is, of course, we still have legal options, right? We can have a European Union-wide ban. We can have other sort of approaches. We can have more global approaches beyond European Union and the US. And then, of course, we still have options like extra legal options, which is the task of business ethics to develop those. So, for example, I call it a more educational approach where we just, you know, go forward and just blame these actors, but rather trying to educate them, raising awareness, increasing their sense for self-interest, like enlightened self-interest for rational actions, and really thinking about the risk it involves being active in China today. And the second thing, of course, and we could see this, it had some effect in the banking sector I was looking at for a while, is the naming and shaming approach by NGOs to via pressure campaigns, so that the reputational risk is increased and business may withdraw from certain business actions due to a too high reputational risk. So these are just some suggestions of what could be done in this case.
Thank you.
And
so
yeah,
much.
that's it.
Thank you. I think we've cut you off there, which wasn't necessarily my intention, but you had up to that point kept to time perfectly, and it felt like you'd come beautifully to the end, and sort of posing really important questions for all of us. You know, what happens if we recognize that we have the legal tools and the ethical standards, and it then becomes about implementation. And that final question, I think, for NGOs, which of course, you know, my bias is where my interest particularly lies, where is the evidence for naming and shaming, and how can NGOs know that it is the right time to apply that pressure? Because we know in some circumstances it can be transformative, and we know that in other circumstances it can really be unhelpful. And we just don't sort of necessarily have all of the answers for that yet, but it was really a fantastic presentation. Thank you. We will continue with this fabulous series of presentations and hand over now to Nusrat, who is going to talk about the really important work of her committee and also bring the perspective of what the UK can and should be doing.
Thank you so much. I've got my timer on because you were brutal with the last speaker. But it's fantastic to be on this stellar panel. I'm hoping that I can share some of the recommendations we made in our select committee report, which in some way answers some of the questions that were raised, whether it's around naming and shaming, updating rules and regulations, and how we can ensure that our values and our ethics continue in our supply chains, and what it means for businesses who don't want their brand to be undermined. Those of you who don't know, I sit on something called the Business Select Committee, and the Business Select Committee follows, in particular, the business department, and we cover everything from COP26 to the steel industry at the moment. And one of my motivations for getting onto the committee was fundamentally to instigate this report. And what's critical to get across to the audience today is that I'm working with fellow legislators. I know we have another stellar legislator speaking later on today, Tim Loughton, because we wanted to make sure that we were approaching the issue of dealing with the Xinjiang crisis from all avenues, making sure we're approaching all government departments that we felt were failing to do their work when it came to ensuring that slave labour was not in our supply chain. And I think that's quite critical to understand, because I don't believe that the campaigning around the Uyghur issue has been this coordinated previously, which probably also explains how successful we were in leading the Genocide amendment to the trade bill, and also the motions in the House on the Olympics that Tim Loughton will speak on later on today, but also having an understanding and a declaration that the UK Parliament does believe that a genocide is taking place. And that's absolutely critical. When you run a select committee, you can encourage and also enforce businesses to come forward and explain their business models. What was critical in the evidence that was presented to us is that a number of businesses were quite comfortable in declaring that they just did not know what was happening in their supply chains, or they just did not know that there was an issue for them to be worried about in Xinjiang. Many of you will sit in this room and think that is just absurd, but they felt that they had the confidence to present that evidence because they had the backup, which is that government had not made statements or legislated in a way to make them rethink their relationship with Xinjiang. So that was the massive gap in legislation that we were trying to fill. And one of the things that was raised with one of the first presenters earlier on today is that businesses will move when there's legislation in place. And there's no denying that legislation can get out of date, but we knew that we had to provide a framework for businesses which would give them the backup that they needed when they were trying to negotiate their move out of Xinjiang or away from slave labour, and continue to operate in China, because that is key for businesses too. And we also wanted to take out some of the political sting for government, for my colleagues who are Secretaries of State, and of course the decision makers in number 10, to say, look, this is the way that we legislate everywhere in the world. We cannot have an exemption for China and Xinjiang. I must also explain that a number of businesses that came forward were trying to do the right thing or wanted to do the right thing, but they just did not know how to go about it because their supply chains are so linked to China, or their custom base requires them to have access to China. So it becomes incredibly complicated. However, having said that, we know how much legislation is in place for dealing with the environment, and COP26 will deliver even more legislation. So when there is a will and a way, and legislation and fines, businesses will inevitably do the right thing. So we tried to put together a framework for government. Unfortunately, government wasn't comfortable with the framework that we were presenting, because basically the statement we were making on the back of the evidence the Select Committee received was that Xinjiang is an open-air prison. And there's no other place on earth where there are more people bonded into slavery than in Xinjiang. Once you understand the evidence exists for that statement, then there's no get-out clause for any business to explain why they're in Xinjiang. And we wanted to name and shame and say to government, why don't we have a black and white list? You're on the blacklist if you cannot show evidence that you have a clean supply chain, and then you can move on to a white list. And we know that if you're in Xinjiang, you cannot even go in and do any basic due diligence. So companies would be either encouraged to move or try and ensure that people that they're working with weren't bonded into slavery. That was the critical recommendation that we were trying to land. It also then put pressure on government to make sure that their procurement supply chains are clean. And we already are reading anxiety about PPE procurement and what that means for government too. It also then starts a motion and also encourages some sort of transparency about where taxpayers' money is going when it goes through government departments such as Department of International Trade, FCDO, and also through BEIS as well, when that money ends up in China. So we asked the government to be transparent about ODA funding, which it struggled to do so, and also about arm's length organisations that it was also securing funding for, such as the Newton Fund supported projects as well. It begins to unravel a number of things which become difficult for government. So we thought we'd make it completely politically neutral and say, look, in this country, we have a set of values, we have a set of ethics, and we do have some legislation, whether we refer to the 1897 Foreign Prison Goods Act or even Modern Slavery Act, but it's no longer fit for purpose. Just as the legislation around diversity, around the environment, human rights, we accept, has to be updated. We now have to update legislation so it ensures that nobody is profiting out of Uyghur slave labour, and fundamentally, British customers aren't being duped into buying slave labour goods as well. So we looked at quite practical things. Forgive me, I'm just going to check my timing. Oh dear, a minute left. Everything looking at the Company Directors Disqualification Act, the Black and White List I've already looked into, updating the Modern Slavery Act, looking at supply chain transparency, also recommending that companies have obligations, or when they fall foul of those obligations, where there's no compliance, that there's actually penalties that fit into the price and earnings sort of growth. So smaller companies are penalised less, larger companies are penalised more. And all this information has to be kept somewhere on a public website, because we fundamentally believe that businesses won't move until they believe that there is some sort of reputation risk. And until that takes place, then it's going to take a huge amount of time to get the movement that we needed. But it also does the biggest thing that we need to try and deliver over the next couple of years. How do we get the British public to feel closer to the Uyghur issue? And how do we help the British public buy goods that haven't been produced by slave labour? And they can only do that when they can make choices and understand which companies are profiting from the misery and which companies are making incredibly tough decisions, like H&M, to ensure that their supply chains are clean. And we know that by doing so, then they are removed from the country they also want to sell products into as well. I'm looking forward to the debate we're going to have, but I must put on record my thanks to so many people, not just Professor Joe, but also to ASPI, and in particular Nathan Russo, who spoke to this issue on his presentation earlier on in this week. But we somehow have to capture all the intelligence and the facts in this room and ensure it's relatable to the mum and dad shopping in the high street. And until we do so, I don't think we're going to get the movements that we need in the time frame that we have, considering the abuse that's taking place. Run out of time. Thank you. Thank you.
I started off by saying, your own commitment to really believing that there is this responsibility and need to look at all avenues that we can sort of confront this appalling situation in Xinjiang. And I really want to take the opportunity here to sort of thank you and many others in this room who have done, I think, certainly from my perspective, the most effective job at bringing the issue of supply chains, not just to the forefront on the issue and our responsibilities around Xinjiang, but in our responses to modern genocide and atrocities. I've never seen anything like it, and I think it's changed the asks of atrocity prevention forever. And I really am humbled by that work and grateful. And just as an example of why I think that is so important, the FCO advice to British businesses who were looking to do business in Myanmar up until at least 6 months after the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Rohingya that took place a few years ago was that the country was in a process of democratic transition and it rains a lot. And that is not sufficient. And we need to update these frameworks because, we shouldn't assume that businesses know what's happening. They should know. But unfortunately, as your work has really shown, that's the case. Would you like to come back?
The critical thing to learn is because of all the campaigning that has been done, whether it's by individuals in this room, whether it's by fantastic NGOs, and in particular IPAC, there is no firm can now ever give evidence in a legal setting or in a parliamentary setting and say, we did not know.
Yeah.
They knew the day that we moved the amendment to the trade bill, and they definitely knew the day that the UK Houses of Parliament declared that a genocide is taking place in Xinjiang. That is date zero for them.
Absolutely, and it's really just testament to so much hard work by so many. We now move on to Rachel, who is going to be talking to us about the issue of cultural genocide, the role of UNESCO, and we really look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thank you very much. I must say it's a real privilege and honour to be on this fantastic panel. It's great to feel this kind of energy around this topic. So what I'd like to do in my short slot is to resurface the question of culture in our debates. I really think that the sphere of culture has not been sufficiently prioritised in the campaigns so far, perhaps with the honourable exception of the Uyghur human rights project. So I look forward to more work happening in this sphere. What I want to speak particularly about today is heritage, both tangible and intangible cultural heritage. I'd like to think about the kinds of pressure that might be brought to bear on UNESCO, in particular, to respond to the abuses taking place in the Uyghur region. So in the conference, we've already heard accounts of the evidence of destruction of religious built heritage. We have excellent detailed surveys by ASBI and the Uyghur Human Rights Project about the destruction of mosques, of shrines, of graveyards. So I won't revisit that detail. I think it's crucial to remember that this physical destruction is only one part of the attacks on religious practice. A building may still stand, but be inaccessible to worshippers. It may be, of course, transformed into a tourist venue, for example. What we also know to supplement the evidence on the destruction of buildings, of course, the detailed reports we now have of the large-scale detention of imam, of religious figures, and also, of course, the widespread restrictions on everyday religious practice. So the evidence is certainly there. So I thought it was very interesting on the first day to hear Nathan Roos's talk, and he showed a graph which correlated the sites, the religious sites which have been destroyed, with sites which are recognized under China's heritage system. And it was interesting to see that that recognition of these sites as heritage had a small impact. There was a small degree of protection accorded by inclusion in the heritage system, but ultimately not a great deal. So just in terms of the built heritage, we should note, of course, that China has not submitted any examples of built Uyghur heritage to UNESCO's lists. Of course, I don't think that means that UNESCO should not have a view, therefore, on what's been going on there in terms of the built heritage. I think, really UNESCO should also have a view, simply because China is one of its major partners in the sphere of heritage. However, in the sphere of intangible cultural heritage, that is, things that people do, traditions, living practices, we do have two items of Uyghur intangible cultural heritage which have been recognized by UNESCO, placed on their lists. That's the Mukam musical repertoire and the Meshrep community gatherings. And so in terms of intangible cultural heritage, then, UNESCO's responsibility is much more direct. And so this, of course, is particularly my own area of interest. I've written a couple of journal articles, as some of you know, about the Meshrep gatherings, and New Lines Institute, of course, very kindly produced a report on that, which is sitting on the desk there, I think. So in my work, I've really talked about the effective bans on community-led grassroots cultural gatherings in the region. I've talked about the detention of Meshrep leaders, and the transformation of Meshrep from community gatherings into staged spectacles and tourist attractions, their use in cultural diplomacy. And I've argued that really they are being used to whitewash China's policies of cultural erasure in the region. And so for that reason, I think it's very problematic that UNESCO has made no response to developments in the region. And I would like to find ways to bring more pressure to bear on its heritage committees, particularly to consider these issues. Of course, following on from the panel yesterday about the UN, I'm not greatly optimistic about the chances of getting any tangible action. Just as the panel yesterday discussed, China is also heavily involved in the heritage sphere within UNESCO. It's, of course, now by far the biggest player worldwide, especially in the sphere of intangible cultural heritage, has the largest number of items on UNESCO's lists. It's a key player, is currently chairing the World Heritage Committee also. Even so, of course, I think it's important to pursue this. Firstly,
because I think heritage is really important to the Chinese government. It's a useful tool for governance, for economics, and it also brings a lot of symbolic capital, both internally and internationally. I also think it's important to pursue this more generally because UNESCO's heritage conventions have an awful lot to say about ethics. The talk on their website about human rights and indigenous rights is extremely prominently displayed, and I really think that they should demonstrate there is more to this than just empty words. So what might we ask of UNESCO? So over the past few years, I have spoken with people working within the UNESCO heritage system. I get an awful lot of emphasis on the fact that once an item of heritage is inscribed on the lists, then it's really in the hands of the state. It's for the state party to implement its protection policies. So I don't really buy that one. You know, UNESCO's International Council on Monuments and Sites does raise its voice on certain issues. It expressed concern, for example, when Turkey transformed the Hagia Sophia Museum into a mosque. And of course, we've just recently seen the decision to withdraw heritage status from Liverpool's historic waterfront. So in these conversations about the Uyghur case, you know, people within UNESCO have also asked me, Rachel, what do you really want? Do you really want us to withdraw this heritage status from these Uyghur items? Wouldn't that be just another blow to the Uyghurs? So I'd be interested to hear responses to that one from Uyghurs in the conference today. But personally, I do feel like we're really beyond that stage, and the continued presence of Meshrep on UNESCO's lists is really too outrageous. You know, this is something that places the seal of approval on China's role as protector of Uyghur culture from UNESCO, when, as we've seen, of course, the regime is actively engaged in the destruction of this culture. So if I have another 2 minutes, oh, loads of time. So what I'd really like to see then, of course, is to see UNESCO acting more broadly. Well, so one, specifically in the sphere of Uyghur heritage, for UNESCO to be asking questions of China about what is going on. I'd like to see UNESCO sending in independent investigators, producing an independent report on how China is protecting Uyghur culture. I would really like to see this within a broader move within UNESCO to develop and implement a review mechanism, particularly with a focus on human rights aspects of safeguarding heritage. So, you know, moving beyond this focus on China to an international focus. I'd like to see UNESCO actually introducing consequences for any state parties to UNESCO conventions who fail to abide by international human rights instruments, and particularly when those rights violations touch specifically on the heritage items included on UNESCO's lists. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, a really interesting and important inquiry into UNESCO as a kind of option of leverage, not just for, again, the situation in Xinjiang, but in other situations of atrocity. Really important, and also some questions to the audience in that panel. So do consider your reflections on that. Last and by no means least, and such an important final contribution to this panel, as we are here in a university, a number of us are affiliated to universities. James, academic action, scholarly responsibility. What can we do? What can universities do?
Well, I'm going to start out by speaking about some of the institutional problems around studying Xinjiang, and then I'll move on to how I think they might be addressed. So the Xinjiang crisis clearly is not entirely unique. There have been many historical attempts to suppress particular ethnic groups or the transmission of practices and traditions of a group from one generation to the next. However, at least in recent history, it is unique in other senses. So the scale of the repression, of course. Yesterday we saw a comparison to the Chan people, for example, whose Cambodian population of 600,000 is roughly 4% of that of the Turkic Muslim minorities we're looking at now. So the scale, but also, as Rachel Harris just said, the particular cultural focus of what's going on and the particular ways in which culture has been targeted. The technological and social innovations in repression that we've seen, the Uyghurs as the most surveilled group in the world, the destruction of urban landscapes and sacred geography, and the intimate restrictions on cultural practice. Now, this distinctive cultural character has generated a distinctive, even exceptional response in that it has been led by anthropologists and other social scientists who have employed the anthropological practices of long-term embedded fieldwork, the sustained development of relationships with informants, and the commitment to the holistic understanding of human society, which, for example, takes into account the connections between language, kinship, labor, and land. And whilst the work of journalists and politicians in these circumstances is predictable, social scientists have been unusually prominent in various ways in producing original evidence, such as, for example, Adrian Zenze's statistical work, but also in developing a usable picture of the relevant context, such as, for example, outlining the implications of the desecration of mazars, with which the world at large was not familiar. These are necessary endeavors, given that many of the outrages underway in Xinjiang cannot be intuitively understood in the way that gas chambers or killing fields can. However, they're endeavors undertaken in the context of two broad impediments, which together make the kinds of activist or applied use of scholarship that we're seeing at this conference difficult or perilous. The first is a general problem afflicting research in hazardous or unpredictable contexts, which has been brought to the fore by the scale of the crisis in Xinjiang and by the difficulty in gaining access to it. And that's the way that research ethics are administered around the primary ideal of protection. Ethical codes developed by universities, funders, and professional bodies emphasize that we should do no harm. And in practice, that means that no work can imperil participants or researchers. But the practical consequences of this is that primary research in Xinjiang often becomes technically out of bounds. And this was a problem even before the current crisis, but it's much worse now. Contacting people, naming names, visiting the region, all violate this principle. And I'm not saying, of course, that protection isn't an important ideal, so much as that the normative codes we're familiar with offer no scope for the concept that it's often more unethical to do nothing. That we are, as academics with the capacity to make sense of the crisis, compelled to do so, and also, where we can, to contribute to the preservation of the culture and the lives of the people in Xinjiang. Of course, most of the people in this room are doing exactly this, but in doing that, they're skirting these formal codes, which of course shifts liability from their institutions to themselves. And of course, liability is the reason ethics administration exists in the form it does now, which brings me to the second issue, that the possibility of Chinese state interference in institutions or in individual careers directly makes engagement with these issues unwise on a personal level. There is, of course, the issue of what Perry Link once called the anaconda in the chandelier, the possibility that one could suddenly and permanently lose access to the field that one's dedicated one's life to, as is suggested by the sort of sanctions applied to Joe Smith-Finley recently. But there's also more insidious influences. Working on Xinjiang-related issues brings with it the potential for trouble that universities are not eager to expose themselves to. A scholar in this room told me that they suspect they were passed over for a job on the basis of their work on Xinjiang, that they'd been explicitly excluded from research funding bids and discussions so as not to complicate things. These more insidious ways by which Xinjiang scholarship is curtailed are the product of the chilling effect produced as a side product of direct actions by the Chinese state. In my own case, I chose to drop out of a panel with Joe Smith-Finley and Rachel Harris at the last minute after being begged by a close colleague who'd feared the consequence of being associated with me if I spoke publicly about something so political. And neither the fears of that colleague nor of those departments cautious about Xinjiang scholars are unjustified. China has form for interference in both the lives of Chinese citizens overseas and in foreign scholarship, as has been stated by the Foreign Affairs Committee. The thoroughly discussed activities of the Confucius Institutes are a key example of this, but what is perhaps a more pressing concern in the case of scholarship in Britain is the fact that 1/5 of all tuition fees in this country are paid by Chinese overseas students. It's 25% in Russell Group universities, and in some institutions it approaches 40%. And in an extremely competitive field that British universities now occupy, these numbers should speak for themselves. I've no doubt that the academics in this room have all witnessed the panic over student recruitment in the course of the pandemic, and Chinese students and the very high fees they pay have been significant in this. Their contribution to the coffers of Western universities explains, I'd argue, the lack of university executive condemnation of the situation in Xinjiang. Student unions and university senates have been more free to position themselves in terms of this, but as far as I'm aware, only ULB in Belgium, thanks to the efforts of Dr. Frangville, has made a statement as an institution. Research groups and centers of which I'm a part have similarly refused to put out public statements, not least in order to protect the Chinese students and researchers that are also affiliated with them. These are not constraints, incidentally, that apply in comparable circumstances because other countries lack the will or the muscle to interfere in these ways. So what then is the appropriate academic response in the face of these constraints? In terms of formal codes of ethics, which are in any case in much need of reform, the first step must be to consider when and if extraordinary circumstances should precipitate exceptions to standard ethical approaches, i.e., in this case, what is the appropriate academic response when information is restricted, the extent of events unclear, and the danger of particular approaches entirely unknown? What's the ethical way to proceed in an environment of fundamental uncertainty? At what point does the scope of apparent inhumanity demand a shift from an ethics of protection to an ethics of action? And how can universities manage these sorts of risks in a way that makes them a useful force for good in the world? In terms of university support for academics working on Xinjiang, there are a few practical steps. It's clear that the current way that British universities are funded makes academia vulnerable to pressure, and in this sense is a threat to academic freedom. And I direct that point to any MPs from the ruling party who may be listening. And in the absence of a fundamental shift in the way that universities are funded, concrete steps need to be taken to protect researchers, including first, I'd suggest, and this is more tentative, an expansion of the University of Sanctuary program to offer welcome to Chinese academics and scholars who wish to address these issues. I'd also suggest targeted scholarship programs along the lines of the Mandela scholarships that emerged during apartheid. My home institution of Sussex still trades on its radical history and on its resistance to apartheid, and I'd argue if Sussex and institutions like it want to stay on the right side of history, it needs to take an equivalent position now. Which brings me to my final point, that as in the business world, no one university wants to be the one that is censored by the Chinese state, which is to say that if we want one university to condemn the treatment of Xinjiang's oppressed people, we need a large number of them to do so simultaneously. And I think that's my 8.
Thank you very much, and some, really challenging questions that we all need to think about. First of all, thank you for bringing into the room, the personal risks and sacrifices that so many here are already making and putting on the line, and the scale of the challenge that collectively we face in speaking out for human rights violations being committed by the Chinese state is not small, and many in this room are already paying big prices for that. And we send solidarity, and thanks for acknowledging that. It's important. And also, of course, how do we then think about institutional structures and means of confronting these big challenges and finding that balance between supporting scholars and researchers and students and foreign students and Chinese students who are themselves facing increased hate crime and discrimination in the UK, sometimes as a result of very clumsy policies. We now open the floor to questions. So those of you that are joining us online, in the room, please, bring your questions. We've had a very full, rich panel, and I'm sure you must have many questions to raise. I certainly do. Who do we have? One on the right. Where's our microphone? We've got it. You at the back? Okay, fabulous.
Thank you so much, all of you. I have one question for James and then a comment to Rachel. I think the point you make of not doing anything, being more unethical than doing things that might cause some harm is very to the point and is something that needs to be considered on ethical committees more generally. I've myself had a really difficult choice to make back in 2018 when I first started to speak up about the atrocities and the mass incarceration going on in Xinjiang, because I had stayed in the region for almost 2 years in the years prior to that, and I'd been in contact with a lot of people whom I knew would be contacted once I started speaking up about it. Till today, I still don't know what kind of repressions have been targeted at these people, and it's something that I live with all the time when I come to events like this and when I speak about it. So I think this is something we really need to consider also beyond the issue of Xinjiang, but more generally, because I think there are a lot of places around the world where scholarship is not being done and pursued out of an intent to do no harm, but actually not speaking about it does a lot of harm. So I was wondering how you see us moving ahead with that process of discussion, and what kind of fora we can maybe bring these thoughts into. And the second thing I would like for you is just to reflect a little bit on what it means to have a commercialized university system, for instance, like in the UK and in the US, what that means for the balance between capital and ethics in universities and for knowledge production. And to Rachel, I just wanted to say, and I would like maybe for you to reflect on that, as for removing Muqam and Meshrep from the UNESCO list, I think symbolically it would hurt a lot of Uyghurs very much at a moment where they don't need that. And I also think it would take a tool away from us in the sense of saying, these are on UNESCO's list, how are they being practiced today? And maybe rather than forcing UNESCO to do something about it, we could use this much more publicly, or we could use this in other contexts. And I was wondering what you think about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions either online or from the floor? And also, just to reiterate Rachel's question to the room, sort of this view on UNESCO status, if there are others that have opinions in the room, I really urge you to use this opportunity and have a conversation. But otherwise, I will return those questions to James first, and then Rachel and anyone else who wants to come in on the back of that.
Thank you, Runa, for your question. In terms of how we can proceed with discussions about different ways of approaching research ethics, I think really that particularly the freer social sciences, like anthropology or sociology, need to jettison the idea of normative codes in the first place and move more towards a virtue-based system of ethics. This is quite a theoretical and boring element, and I'll get back to you in detail about this in future. But essentially, as far as I understand it, the ethical codes that we adhere to now were originally not designed for us, but for medics, and they don't fit very well with the kind of work that we do. In terms of the problem of commercialized universities, I think you're absolutely right. And I have a forthcoming chapter about this that I'll also discuss with you. But essentially, if universities need to follow the rationality of the market, they will not follow any other kind of ethical framing unless they're forced to. And where with business, the suggestion has been perhaps we need some more pressure from above, I think in universities that needs to be pressure from below. So in the case of apartheid, it was pressure from students that first got universities to move towards taking legislative action within their own departments. So I think that's the way forward. And also just get rid of the commercialization of universities and get the block grant back, obviously.
Okay, I feel like I could talk for quite a long time about the commercialization of universities, but I will not. Okay. Thank you, Runa, for your question about the Muqam and Meshrep. Do we really want to ask UNESCO to take them off the list? Well, I think that the way that the, my anonymous friend within the UNESCO system framed that question to me was really an attempt to shut down my queries, my problems, you know. And so I don't think we should be taking that off the agenda, you know. I mean, I think there should be that sanction available. Of course, I completely understand that would be a very distressing thing for Uyghur people, but, you know, there's a lot of distressing stuff going down, right? So, you know, ideally, you know, there should be mechanisms, there should be processes, there should be stages, and the thing I would really like to be calling for right now is some serious independent investigations into what's going on the ground. You know, I mean, we're all very familiar with the use across the world of heritage as stage spectacle, you know, but this problem goes beyond that. What is happening on the ground within the communities? UNESCO's rhetoric is all about grassroots community practice. So why can't UNESCO send in independent investigators to be with communities, find out what's going on? Are MeSREP happening on the ground or not? You know, and just in terms of other avenues that we can pursue, I mean, of course, you know, I think it's really important for us as academics and activists to be engaging with communities in whatever way we can. So, you know, we've had this project running at SOAS for the past couple of years, supported by the British Academy Sustainable Development Fund, which has been working with Uyghur diaspora communities in Kazakhstan and supporting them in their efforts to use MeSREP really to revitalize their communities and to impel sustainable development and bring economic benefits to the community. So, you know, that kind of thing is also extremely important. We've been a bit slowed down by COVID, of course, but we do hope to get back to that.
I've got time for one more final question if we have. Otherwise, I might... Oh, is there someone just behind our cameraman who I can't see? Oh, please. Where's our microphone? Could you please introduce yourself for the benefit of our online participants, please? Sure.
Yeah, my name is Marine Mazel, and I'm a psychoanalyst from Paris. So, yeah, just thank you so much, Rachel and James, also to raise this question of how to position yourself as a scholar and also an activist. This is such a difficult question, and indeed, I wanted to share a reflection about that, because you're in such a special field, and now you have to face, like you said, James, fears, threats, and I share a lot with all the scholars who are here since 2 days. And I think there is a real need to create a space for you as scholars and activists, and this is a kind of a mixed identity. And I think you said, Rune, you said like you felt guilty about some stuff, and I think this guilt, this shame, these fears, etc., they need to be processed in a space. And this is what ethics is about. It's not about committees who are dealing about abstract concepts. It is about sharing in groups very regularly, as we do in our fields, you know, like to share what does it mean, for example, to take this position, to remove the MeSREP or the McMURRAY from the UNESCO, you know. And I think scholars shouldn't be afraid to share their feelings about that, because feelings are not things that needs to be removed. It's part of the reflection. So I suggest maybe that into your community, maybe you start to think about a space in which you can share regularly about that and find out ways to maybe a bit relieve yourself from this kind of a burden. So, yeah.
And I'm sure that there is no one in this room that disagrees with the need for more of that in the scholarly community and far beyond. That has brought us to the end of our time here, but I'm sure that you will agree that all of our panelists have given us so much, not just food for thought, but really concrete pathways to how we as sort of consumers and individuals and participants in institutions and sometimes business and the environments that we inhabit can sort of uphold our responsibilities towards those populations, not only in Xinjiang, but facing atrocities all over the world. We can discuss these issues more in our coffee break, but first of all, I'm going to hand over to Jo for final comment.
Like this? Yeah. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to take this opportunity during this panel to express my respect for this university on several counts. One, to thank them for their unequivocal support and defence of me at the time of my political sanction in March. Secondly, to say that this university recently became a university of sanctuary, which we are very proud about. So we will have at least 3 scholarships per year for students coming from refugee or asylum seeker backgrounds. And thirdly, to say that this university is also beginning to make some changes which I think are really important and conducive to an ethical standpoint. Namely, we are starting to diversify our international student intake. So we are looking very carefully at the question of dependency on Chinese students, and we are looking to diversify our student intake, which I think is this is also happening in the wake of COVID. But I think that this is having very positive ramifications also for the ethical questions that we've talked about. The other thing that this university is doing, which I would like to see other universities doing as well, is that they are increasingly, the top management stratum are increasingly calling on the expertise of area studies experts, particularly those who are working on authoritarian governments or areas of the world, and asking for their input and advice when making decisions about research collaborations and research funding decisions. I think these are really important things to be doing, and I would really like to see other universities doing the same thing. So yeah, just to express my respect to this institution, who, by the way, funded almost all of this event.